In this HPE ALM Octane video, we're going to cover the lifecycle demo and a flow of assets as they evolve throughout the release lifecycle. I'm starting in Dashboard. You can see I have a number of different widgets available and graphs to show me what's going on within my environment, status of open items, and of course, if I want, I can drill in and get additional details on why, for example, I maybe have two very high items within my contacts group. In particular, though, I'm going to start off in the backlog module. So we begin by creating a user story, and you see that user stories are broken up based on themes, features, and then just stories. So themes are the higher level abstractions, features maybe live within themes, and then user stories are the ground level representation of the business flow itself. On the left-hand side, I've organized these into logical functional areas to help me understand how related entities can be shared or connected. And of course, within here, I also have my own view of content within the backlog itself. So I can have separate widgets, separate charts and graphs, ways of actually viewing information for me. So we'll start by actually creating a new user story. And so this is, again, our messaging application. I'm going to suggest here as a user story that as a user, I need to be able to view details on a contact within my list. You can see that there's a number of different fields. Some of these have red icons next to them indicating that I've chosen to make them mandatory at this part in my life cycle. I'm going to choose a parent. In this case here, we'll choose one of those generals and then general areas over here. I have no additional mandatory fields except for story points. And again, if I choose to actually proceed without putting in story points, the system will prompt me to suggest what I might need to put in here as a mandatory field. I may suggest 4 for this example here. So I've created a new user story, and you're seeing the relations view right now. Now, relations are very important within the Octane environment. This is how we understand how to prioritize our work. This is how we understand how things are connected amongst each other. So for example, over time, user stories can become connected to tests. Tests may have defects that are logged during an execution. Ultimately, I need to be able to understand how these assets relate to one another so I can prioritize my work as the project continues forward. I do have the ability to move this user story through a specific state transition, my workflow itself. So I'm going to actually add 2 different tests to connect a relationship to this here to validate my business functionality. The first is a pre-existing test here I have. I know it happens to be a gherkin test, and so of all of the options I have available to me, I can actually choose to just search dynamically here for the word gherkin. I happen to know that's the name of this test. I can begin to connect that and form the relationship that you can see here visually. So we'll drill in and we'll take a look at the gherkin test itself, which I can do simply by clicking on this within my relations view. And if I click on the script tab, I can see that the gherkin script itself, which is a structured language that we can use to define a manual test, it helps in a lot of ways transition this to an automated test potentially later on using a tool like LeanFT, for example, within the IDE, because we can transfer the same structural entity over and then add to it additional object maps and so forth as we begin to choose and automate this functionality. There are different versions available of this, and because we're tracking everything within the environment using Git as our backend repository, it's very easy for me to do a compare. So I can understand how things evolve over time. I'm creating an audit history and an audit trail that's very important to be able to understand and represent work that's been done over time. Let me go back though. So I'm going to add an additional test type to this user story here by clicking on it. And this is that user story I created earlier here. As a user, I need to be able to view details on a contact within my list. I've already got my gherkin test connected to it, but I'm actually going to add a new test to it. And we'll choose to add this other test type to it. This is a step-based manual test, which is very analogous to some of the tests that we may have within the Quality Center product or the HPE ALM product. In this case, I'm validating that user story, the business functionality. So I'm going to say validate that contact details are properly displayed when user selects to drill down. Obviously, the subtype is going to be a manual test. There's additional tags that I can choose to select here, and this helps me organize and decide which work needs to go where later on as I move through the life cycle. I'll choose to edit this, and you can see I'm immediately brought in to add some new steps. There's 2 different ways we can view information within here. So I can go over to the text editor. This is text. It's a freeform text editing environment where I can just add text as I may want to put in anything basically for this manual test. What's probably more familiar though is this visual step-based approach. And this, I'll change the text here to something a little bit more practical. The user selects to open the messaging application. Add another step below it. The user selects to view details on a contact. And then what I may choose to do here is add a validation step. And this is where I can select a pass or fail during my manual test execution. So my validation might be the system displays the correct contact details. And again, a very simple example here. What I'm showing here is I save this. I'll say there's a label. We'll call it initial. I can begin to then run this next. But what I've done effectively here is I've created a manual test that's been connected to a user story. I'm beginning this chain of assets, the various relations that become very, very critical to me and my team as we begin to work later on and understand the prioritization of things that we need to do on the project. And so we'll go ahead and run this test. There are some mandatory fields that the system's already filled in for me, so we'll go ahead and we'll run it. You can see that the manual runner is opened up, and these were the steps that I just entered a moment ago within the other application behind us or the other window. So I choose to enter in some additional information. The system does in fact open correctly. Move down to the next step here. The user selects to view details. I could choose to enter something, but eventually I'll get to this point where I can decide, did this next step, the system displaying correct contact details, pass, fail, was it not completed, or was it blocked? For the purposes of this demonstration, let's just say it failed. I'll say the system displayed an error message. A pretty vague result, and we see this all the time, of course, out there. So what I'll do is I'll add a defect. And what the defect has done is, of course, we've launched a new screen with different fields. Some of them are mandatory, but some of the stuff is also filled in automatically by the Octane system itself. It knows the context. It's helping me do a lot of this manual work to keep this information more repeatable and easier to understand for other people within my process. So the name of the defect, I'll be very, very generic here and very, very vague and say there was an error. Now, because this field is mandatory for severity, if I choose to save here instead, it's not going to allow me to proceed because I have to select a valid value within here. Now, these are customizable values, but if I say here high, for example, I can then choose to save. So I've created a new defect. I've connected it to my test execution, which is connected to my manual test, which is connected to my user story. Again, we're building this asset chain of the various artifacts. So if I close this over here, the next place I may want to go and look is over in the defects module. So now if we go back into the defects module over here, we're able to see that there's a number of different things that are visible to me. And this is normal. Over time, we would expect to see a number of different things inside here. So we need to be able to quickly filter this down either based on search or by using some of these tags, severity, phase, and so forth. I happen to know that I had that very, very vague error message that I logged earlier on here. So I can use that as my search, and I can click to drill in and get more details. So I can see the high-level relations inside here. I can view the details of the additional record. And you'll note that there's additional fields visible to me that I didn't see when I actually created the defect. And that's because we have different forms available. So the idea is that I can have a certain set of fields available when I submit something. It's generally the minimum requirement things that the team would need in order to be able to reproduce or prioritize that. And then we have, of course, additional fields available during the next phase, the triage, where we have to track additional things like, for example, story points or fixed on or owner or so forth. What you'll also see inside here is that I have the ability to move it between the different states of our workflow. So I can move to open, for example. But you'll notice I can't move it to fixed within that lifecycle because there's various rules that we have in place to stop the movement of that. It may be something as simple as I have to save the entity, and maybe something as simple as I have a mandatory field that could be required in order to move that next level. Some organizations may actually provision that based on your permissions as a user. So certain users are unable to fix their own defects, for example. Those that log the defect may not have permissions to necessarily fix the defect. Depends on your process, but there are all sorts of ways that you can enforce policies and process within here. So again, just a quick overview of what we were able to do. We started off in the backlog module. We created a user story. We connected it to that existing Gherkin test. We then created a new manual test. We executed that. We found an error and logged a defect. And now I can come to the defect module where I am now, where I can review additional information. I may even choose to assign this to somebody on the project team. Ultimately, back at the dashboard, Any of these items that I've created, any of the things that I've saved, become things that I can report on within the actual dashboard itself. It's updated in real time. It gives me a perspective into what's going on. Now that's the overall flow that we wanted to do for the lifecycle demo. Of course, at any time, you can get additional help by clicking on the Help Center in the top right.